Hello, everybody. Welcome. My name is Michael Scharf. I'm the co-dean of Case Western Reserve University School of Law. It's my great privilege today to welcome you to a very important topic that will be discussed by some people who have great insights. And the topic is the starvation crimes that are being committed as part of the Yemen conflict. And as many of you may know, the Yemen conflict is one of the worst conflicts with the most suffering in our lifetime. And so a couple of years ago, Jim Johnson, who is this amazing professor at our law school, he is the director of our Henry King War Crimes Research Office, teaches our international criminal law class and our international law research lab. And in his spare time, he is the chief prosecutor of the Special Court of Sierra Leone's Residual Court. He came to me and he said, Michael, I'd like the law school and the students to do something in this really important area because right now there is no official investigation going on. The evidence is going to be lost and we need to do something to preserve it and to jumpstart it when things are ready to go. So he asked me if there were some students that he might suggest for this. And I said that I had been working with some amazing students like Laura Graham and Liz Sapir, and they became the leaders of the group as 1Ls. And I should say the two of them are on our Jessup International Law Moot Court team. Now I'm going to embarrass Laura, but they just finished the competition and our team was third best in the world. It was the top US team. It was quite a spectacular feat for our law students and we're very proud of them. I also want to thank our alum, Tim Geis, for his and his family foundation's support of this project. We went to him and described what we wanted to do and he was extremely generous and it's allowed us to do conferences and panels and bring in experts and do all kinds of things. Just if you don't know about our law school, we're very pleased to let you know that this year we were in the top 10 international law programs according to Pre-Law Magazine, and US News and World Report, which just came out 2 weeks ago, ranked us 16th best international law program. We're also, as a law school, ranked 6th in practical training. And this project, the Yemen Accountability Project, combines the two, the international law and the practical training. It allows our students to have a hands-on experience. So at Case Western Reserve, our students don't just come here to prepare to someday change the world when they graduate. We tell them that they can come here and do things like the Yemen Accountability Project, where they will have an impact. They will be change agents while they're in law school. So with that, let me introduce Jim Johnson. He's going to be moderating the panel and he will introduce the panelists. Thank you all for joining us today.
Well, Michael, thank you very much. It's always hard to live up to your introductions, but I do thank you very much for that introduction and of course introducing the Yemen Accountability Project, which is now in its third year. But we'll get to a little more about what the project is in just a minute. But first, I need to introduce our incredible panelists. And Laura, who you can see on the screen before you, has been very active and she has gathered together some tremendous panelists to talk about YAP's most recent white paper on starvation in Yemen. And so I'd like to take just a minute and introduce our panelists. We have Alex Duvall, the Executive Director of the World Peace Foundation, a research professor at Fletcher School at Tufts University, and is considered one of the foremost experts on Sudan and the Horn of Africa. And I'm just going to say a few words about each panelist. I know that when you signed up, you would have saw a more detailed bio on the website, but Alex is joining us from Boston, I believe. And you know, this is kind of one of the incredible things about Zoom and doing this by Zoom, because we can bring in terrific and qualified panelists from all over the world that otherwise we might not be able to get to the schools. So welcome, Alex, and it is an absolute pleasure to have you here with us. The next panelist is someone who's very familiar on case webinars, I believe, but we have Milena Sterio, Professor of Law and Associate Dean for Faculty Enrichment at Cleveland State University's College of Law. She is, of course, an expert in maritime law, and for our purposes here today, an expert on international prosecutions and avenues to accountability. So thank you very much for joining us here today, Milena. And of course, as Michael has mentioned, Laura Graham. Laura is a third-year law student. She came in as a first-year law student when we created the Yemen Accountability Project, and has taken this project from, when you think of projects of new endeavors, and you think of the crawl, walk, run stage of new endeavors, she took this project from crawl to run in a very, very short period of time. And again, now we're on our second white paper, and it's absolutely wonderful to have the launch of this white paper. And Laura, of course, is an expert in ethnic conflicts, genocide, and mass atrocity. And finally, I'd like to introduce on the screen before you, we have Christine DeSabato. Christine is our incoming executive director. And at the end of the webinar, I'm going to ask Christine to say a few words about where she sees YAP going in the next year. So that's our panelists. And so let's get started. I think, Laura, I would like to go to you first. And I'd like to just, we've mentioned YAP and talked about it and talked about starting YAP a few years ago. But tell us just a little bit about what YAP is and what we're trying to do in YAP.
Yeah, thanks, Jim. So YAP is the Yemen Accountability Project. It is a student-run project here at Case Western Reserve University School of Law. And we have approximately 12 law students that are involved in the leadership of the project. And at various points in time over the past 3 years, we've had as many as 75 student volunteers. Students from Case, Cleveland Marshall College of Law, Ohio State University, Leiden University in the Netherlands, and Trinity College Dublin. So it's a very popular project, and students enjoy being a part of it because it gives them an opportunity to do real legal work, even from being 1Ls. And so that has been a really positive learning experience for the students. But of course, our bigger goal also is to try and help build cases for prosecutions for the war crimes and crimes against humanity that have been committed in Yemen. So that's what we do with our work product. We have 3 divisions that have different focuses for work product, everything from a crime matrix all the way through to releasing of egregious incident dossiers, sample indictments, and the product that everyone is here today to learn about, which is white papers. So we did a white paper last year on aiding and abetting crimes. And the subject of this year's white paper is on building the cases for prosecutions of starvation crimes. And maybe, Jim, maybe I'll just say a little bit of a word about why starvation and where that came from. So when we started this project in 2018, this was really at the height of the starvation and food insecurity crisis that was happening in Yemen. 2017 was an absolutely horrible year for the people of Yemen. There were as many as 13 million people who were at risk of dying from starvation and related diseases such as cholera. And around that time, too, the United Nations had declared Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis. And so I sort of took it on as a personal project to explore what could be done about that in terms of prosecutions, and very quickly learned that there have never been any prosecution crimes prosecuted successfully at any international criminal tribunals. And I wanted to better understand why, and whether or not it was realistic that we could build a case against that. So here we are a couple of years later, and I think that we have done the research and the investigations to connect the dots and build a case of prosecution. And then just very briefly before I turn it back over to you, Jim, I just want to say something about what I mean when I say starvation crimes, because this is a fairly novel concept. In fact, the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court, which codifies starvation crimes, was actually amended in late 2019 to include starvation crimes both in the context of international armed conflicts and non-international armed conflicts, which Yemen would be. So a starvation crime then is a crime that is committed against the civilian population of a country, either where the perpetrator has destroyed objects that are indispensable to survival for civilians, or they have intentionally used starvation as a weapon of war. And so what this white paper does is it looks at those objectives and whether or not there is evidence of intentional destruction of OIS, objects indispensable to survival, or whether, whether there are other aggravating factors that are difficult to establish a causal link.
So Laura, before we move on, what kind of conflict are we having in Yemen?
Such a great question, Jim. Well, of course, it is a civil war. It is described that way because, of course, you have Houthi rebels engaged in a battle against government forces, but it very much has characteristics of an international armed conflict or a proxy war between Saudi Arabia and Iran, because Iran backs Houthi rebels, and Saudi Arabia and the Saudi-led coalition, which includes a number of other Arab nations, have all engaged in military tactics within Yemen. So that's a great question. Is it an international armed conflict or a non-international armed conflict? Well, for the purposes of this paper, we look at it from both angles.
Good, thank you. And before I move on, I did neglect to say at the start, we will open up for questions at the end, but I will also try to take questions during the conference if they are relevant to what we're talking about at the moment. And I believe the question and answer function is working on your Zoom screen, whatever you're looking at in front of you. And so please, if you have any questions, send them to me and we'll try to keep track of them. Okay, Alex, let's move over to you for just a moment and try to look at the big picture of starvation and famine. And in your 2016 book, and by the way, just a plug before we go on, I think Alex has another book about to come out. His 2016 book on mass starvation. You've looked at famicide, which we'll talk about a little bit here today, and you've got another book coming out soon. Is that right?
That's right. I took the opportunity of the lockdown to return to a topic that I used to work on, which was the politics of international public health. So I have this book called, I'll show it again, it's called New Pandemics, Old Politics. The idea being that our responses are very predictable and age old, but the pathogens we face are actually much more creative and new.
Okay, well, Alex, in your 2016 book on mass starvation, you began writing from the perspective of why calamitous famines had become rare in recent history and what could be done to abolish them entirely. And then the famines in Yemen and South Sudan emerged in 2017, leading you to write a very different book about the uses of famine in war and what you describe as famicide. What exactly is this? And is this an appropriate description for what is taking place in Yemen today?
Well, the basic sort of hypothesis, the ground argument of my book is that there is actually no reason for any famine or mass hunger arising from natural calamities in the contemporary world. And I look at the history of the last couple of centuries and I argue, in fact, that what we have seen is that to the extent that we have incidents of mass starvation or famine, they are man-made, gendered, language, deliberate. We haven't had any women-made famines, at least not yet. And particularly they occur either as a side effect of war, as it were, belligerents recklessly pursuing strategies that generate famine out of war, or deliberate as a form of mass atrocity. And it's salutary to read or reread Raphael Lemkin's 1944 book, Axis Rule in Occupied Europe, and realize he actually spends far more time talking about how the Nazis used hunger as an instrument of genocide than they actually used gas chambers or death squads. And the law around prohibiting starvation has not been well formulated. There is the war crime of starvation, which has been specified in the Rome Statute, though never tested in court. We can identify crimes of extermination using hunger, deprivation, there's crimes against humanity. There's the war crime of pillage. Genocide can also be perpetrated through starvation. So if we bundle those all together, we have starvation crimes. And the core concept is the one that Laura just outlined, of the deprivation of objects indispensable to survival for the civilian population. But I would add to that also those instances that are readily recognizable tend to be very discrete, very concrete. The destruction of a hospital, the burning of farms or something like that. But also economic policies, blockade policies, or policies aimed at squeezing people's employment, their income, pursued over a long period of time, can also add up to a starvation crime, I would argue. And for example, the way in which the central bank of Yemen was transferred from Sana'a to Aden, and salaries for civil servants were not paid, in the knowledge that this would cause enormous hardship. I think this counts. And as these economic effects unfold over years, then one, even though the original intent of an economic action may not have been to create starvation, once its consequences become clear, I would argue surely there is a responsibility on those who have control over those levers of policy to stop what they are doing. Because once they become aware of those consequences, they have an obligation to stop and to mitigate or reverse those consequences.
Well, Alex, what were the food conditions in Yemen prior to the outbreak of the conflict, prior to 2015?
Yemen was the poorest nation in the Arab world. It was also very water insecure, a great scarcity, a shortage of clean water. It was heavily dependent upon food imports. About 80% of the food imports for the country came in through commercial imports. And it was also highly dependent upon remittances from workers working abroad, particularly in the Gulf states. So very vulnerable to economic shocks.
Have you seen, since the outbreak of the war, maybe taking advantage of those conditions in Yemen as we move into the conflict and moved into the conflict?
I think so. I think some of those who are, as it were, apologists for those who've created the conditions of starvation make the argument, well, Yemenis were on the brink of serious hunger anyway, to which my response is, everybody knew that. So why wage a war of starvation in a population that is already desperate? And why specifically target those particular economic choke points, like remittances, like the ability of people to use the airport to leave to seek essential medical treatment, like slowing down commercial food imports? Why target those choke points in your war? Does that not make you additionally culpable?
Are there particular phases, or how is famine measured?
There are essentially two ways of measuring it. I mean, historically, if we go back, we tend to use a metric, which is the number of people who died, and a threshold of about 100,000 excess deaths. Deaths above and beyond what would normally occur is considered a threshold for a famine. But that obviously doesn't work when these conditions are unfolding in real time. We don't want to wait to count the graves to say there is a famine occurring. So over the last 15 or so years, the United Nations has developed what it calls the Integrated Food Security Phase Classification System. And I won't go into details, but it has 5 levels. And the top level, level 5, is famine. Next down is humanitarian emergency. And what's significant about this is that each of them are measured using indicators of malnutrition and the functioning of the local food economy. But well before that last stage is reached, people begin to die. So that in a country like Yemen, even when situation of famine is not officially diagnosed, it doesn't mean people aren't dying. We can have tens, even hundreds of thousands of children perishing over many years in a large population without famine being officially declared.
I have a question here that let me ask you. Is what we're seeing in Yemen, is it different, or how is it different, or maybe the same of some of the hunger that we're seeing in many countries in Africa?
And it has many similarities in that it comes about partly through protracted warfare and the disruption of economies that occur. Also, when you are waging economic war, as has been done, over a long period of time, it develops a war economy, depths of corruption, people profiteering from the scarcities of food and medicine, from exploiting populations. These are all phenomena that we see. What I think is unusual in the Yemen case is the extent of aerial bombardment, the targeting of objects indispensable, farmland, clinics, water supplies, by aerial bombardment, which is quite rare, and the extent to which an overall national blockade has to squeeze the economy has been part of the instrument of economic warfare.
In the best of circumstances, no war, collective efforts to mitigate hunger, what does it take to overcome a humanitarian crisis of food insecurity in a place like Yemen?
I think the most important point here to recognize is there are no humanitarian solutions to humanitarian crises. Just stepping up the humanitarian assistance is not enough. It's important, but not sufficient. What has to happen is an end to those starvation crimes and those actions of economic warfare that make it very, very difficult or impossible for people to have a viable livelihood, and beginning to free up the economy, free society, so that people can pursue essential economic activities. And then moving on to rehabilitation, the restoration of essential activities, which is not only an economic activity, but I would say is an exercise in transitional justice. We need to look beyond, obviously, what we're going to talk about today, particularly which is calling out the perpetrators, but also look to issues such as truth-telling, restoration, restitution, compensation, etc., going forward.
Given these factors and what you said, it looks like the use of starvation as a method in warfare was selected to optimize suffering. Have you been seeing that?
I fear that is the case. I think the evidence that we have before us in this white paper and through what we have been learning, despite the restrictions on reporting from Yemen, etc., point to the conclusion that those who designed and implemented this war, at the very minimum, did so with reckless disregard for the well-being, the livelihoods, and the lives of the Yemeni population, and at worst, deliberately intended to deprive them of what was necessary to sustain life.
Alex, in your experience and in your studies, does starvation work?
Starvation, it causes enormous misery. It causes enormous humiliation to people. There is nothing more degrading than being a mother or a father who is unable to care and feed for your children. But it also generates a deep resentment and anger that lives on. And we only need to look at historic cases like Ireland in the 1840s, like Ukraine in the 1930s, to see how deep the sense of hurt, resentment, and grievance can go in a population. So those who perpetrate these starvation crimes will be held to some sort of account, if not by this generation, by a succeeding generation.
Okay. That might be a good place to move into a little discussion of the evidence. And Laura, I might come back to you to talk a little bit about evidence and what you're seeing. And of course, you've devoted a good portion of the white paper, which, by the way, will be out for public consumption when?
It's available already on our website. It is the Yemen Accountability Project, Case Western's Cox Center. And if you just go to the homepage, you will see there the starvation white paper linked.
Okay, thank you. Okay, Laura, let's talk a little bit about the evidence then. First, I'm going to ask you, what do you see in a big picture sense of some of the contributors to starvation in Yemen? And then focus in a little bit on what specific types of objects are we seeing targeted, and how does that cause starvation, and how can it be, and well, we'll get to that in a minute. So please answer that.
Well, so we effectively see three contributors to starvation in Yemen, and Alex has already mentioned one of them with the economic crisis. Another well-known contributor is the blockade of Hudaydah, which was enacted after UN Security Council Resolution 2216, which had a legitimate purpose of an arms embargo, trying to prevent weapons from reaching the Houthi rebels in Yemen, but was either intentionally or not used for other means to disrupt humanitarian aid coming into the country. And so that also had an effect on starvation. But the central focus of our paper is actually on the aerial bombardment of civilian objects that are related to food and water production. So I asked a small team of our YAP members to take a look very closely at the period of 2015 to 2018 and to see what sort of trends emerged in terms of what types of objects were targeted, how frequently, whether there was some kind of connection between a plan or a policy, or if it looked as though it were unintentional, when did it happen? So all of these factors were included, and what we discovered is that there are effectively 5 principal targets that the Saudi-led coalition used or attacked in aerial bombardments, and those are farms and agricultural facilities, water supply and production facilities, the fishing industry, food markets, and medical facilities that in particular focused on distributing aid to individuals suffering from cholera and malnutrition and other related diseases. So I can go into a lot more of the details on that if you're interested.
I think a little more detail would be helpful.
Certainly. Well, I think, so in looking at what happened particularly in the period of 2017 to 2018, in that period, there were 568 Saudi-led coalition strikes on food production, and this included farms, dairy facilities, plant nurseries, as well as agricultural equipment and UN aid distribution facilities. So that's a pretty large number of strikes for it to have been coincidental. In particular, actually, I think some of the more egregious attacks were on water supply and production facilities. So first of all, it's important to point out that in 2011, experts were predicting that Yemen might run out of water as early as 2017. So to attack a country's water supply when it's already having significant water scarcity already is very problematic. So some of the things that we found in this paper is that the Saudi-led coalition targeted water drilling equipment, as well as areas where wells were being drilled, active drilling projects, intact wells, and water supply development infrastructure, including desalinization equipment and sewage and water treatment facilities. We also found that there were at least 20 attacks on the Tihama development Authority, which supplies irrigation to the local farms. And just to kind of put this into perspective, prior to the outbreak of the war, the Tehama region was considered the breadbasket of Yemen, and now 43% of the people there are food insecure. So very significant impact on food production and water production in particular. And one of the more, I suppose, more surprising components of this campaign, at least in my mind, was the attacks on fishing villages. So fishing, the fishing sector was approximately 2% of the gross domestic product of Yemen prior to the war. And so this is one of the reasons that it was targeted. And since 2015, 220 fishing boats have been destroyed, as well as over 145 fishermen, artisanal fishermen, so skilled sets of fishermen who can no longer provide that source of food for people. And all of these strikes were done in broad daylight. They were done in close range from helicopters and warships. So it's not as though anyone could claim that this was an unintentional attack. It was very much purposeful, and it wasn't as though there were legitimate targets in the area. So when you put all of these factors together, it looks as though there was a systemic plan or policy to target civilian objects for destruction.
Well, let's take that a little bit farther, Laura, and Milena, please, if you would like to come in on this a little bit. Of course, a target, if you look at some of the basic targeting principles in conflict, there must be a legitimate military necessity to attack something. It must be a proportional attack in that you avoid unnecessary suffering, unnecessary harm, if at all possible. You must avoid, if at all possible, unnecessary suffering. And always there must be distinction between a legitimate military target and a civilian target or a non-military target. How could that be reconciled? How could you argue that these were legitimate military targets? In your examination of the evidence, have you found military targets at any of these sites?
We have not found that there are legitimate military targets at these sites. So even among the marketplaces where it might be the most likely place to find combatants that might be considered legitimate targets, they were nowhere to be found. And I think, so there's no distinction. But in particular, I think also the proportionality component is just simply cannot be there. The suffering that is caused by starvation, which Alex mentioned just a little while ago, is absolutely enormous. People don't die by starvation quickly. It takes months to die by starvation and related illnesses, and it's just a really inhumane way of killing people. And so, there's simply no proportionality to be met in this type of a tactic, particularly when it targets civilians.
Okay, good. Milena, I don't know, is there anything you'd like to add? Please do.
Sure. Thanks, Jim. So first of all, before I begin, let me just share with Laura and with all the other case students as to how impressed I am with this project and with this white paper. And thank you so much for allowing my own students at Cleveland Marshall the opportunity to participate in this project. Jim, you have basically outlined these basic principles of international humanitarian law, which include distinction, necessity, proportionality, precautions, humanity. The issue here, if we want to move towards a discussion of accountability, is that not every single violation of international humanitarian law gives rise to a war crime. So even if you can establish that violations of IHL have occurred, it doesn't necessarily automatically mean that you can prosecute people for war crimes or crimes against humanity. And so that's where the difficulty in terms of imposing accountability lies, is that a prosecutor still needs to have evidence, still needs to meet all the necessary burdens, if you will, of bringing forward a successful crimes against humanity or war crimes prosecution. So concluding that there are IHL violations is step number one. but there is a lot of work that still then needs to be done in terms of actually imposing accountability on at least some of the perpetrators.
Okay. Thank you. Laura, I'd like you to go back a little bit more. And with that thought, and of course, in a few minutes, we'll go down to what are possible mechanisms of accountability that could go forward. And this is, of course, a discussion that causes a little bit of concern when you're looking at a conflict like Yemen is just that what accountability measures are available. But of course, to prove this, and one of the things that you have referred to is proving intent. And so, this is what evidence of intent are you seeing? Because of course, there's always the claim that this was a legitimate military target, and that this is just, we've all heard the expression collateral damage. And unfortunately, collateral damage is an often overused excuse. But what evidence of intent are you finding that this was indeed, that causing starvation was really intended here?
So the dolus specialis is always very difficult to meet. Of course, every prosecutor wants some kind of statement or document that proves that there was intent. And, this very likely does not exist. There are at least a couple of sources that have stated that there was a Saudi diplomat who off the record stated that first we will starve them, then we will feed them when the war is over. So there's something like that. But I think that finding pieces of evidence like that to build a case of intent is very unlikely. So I think you have to take all of the pieces of information and put them together and build inferences from those facts. So for example, if you take together the conditions in Yemen as they existed before the war, that there was food and water scarcity, and you put that alongside the prevalence of the frequency of attacks on food production and water production facilities, the lack of intervening factors such as legitimate military targets, combatants at the sites of water production facilities, for example, the type of targeted site that it was it exclusively for civilian access, or was it somehow feeding or supplying water to enemy combatants? And then the fact that most of these strikes also took place during the daytime, broad daylight, when they could maximize both the destruction of these civilian objects, but also to cause immediate civilian casualties. All of this points towards building a pattern or a systemic policy of a plan to use starvation as a method of warfare. And I think you have to take all of those pieces together in order to build that inference of intent.
Jim, can I jump in on this as
Please
well?
do. Please
Yes.
do.
So just to follow, I absolutely agree with Laura. Just to follow up on this point, one of the reasons why these types of crimes are difficult to prosecute is because although you might have evidence of attack X occurred on this date against this water supply line, or against this food production facility, or against this farm, and you also have evidence that, for example, 50 individuals died, we as lawyers know that there is this little thing called causation, right? You have to establish that the attacks actually caused the death of these individuals, if that's what you're trying to prosecute. And a clever defense counsel can say, well, yeah, these individuals died, but they died because of disease or infection or some other reason. In other words, there is no but cause, there's no but for causation here. And so I absolutely agree with Laura that this means that prosecutors are going to have, whatever forum we're talking about, right? Prosecutors are going to have to be clever as well and use essentially inferences and perhaps a little bit of circumstantial evidence to build these cases. And I would argue that we have precedent for that from other tribunals. One of the most famous cases that I can mention, this is not a starvation case, but it is a relevant international criminal tribunals case, is the genocide prosecution against Karadzic, who was the former leader of the Bosnian Serbs. In that case, prosecutors had no direct evidence of intent that this person actually told others go ahead and commit genocide with respect to Srebrenica, and yet prosecutors were able to use circumstantial interventional type evidence to build that case. And so I do think that by now we have this precedent of using perhaps less direct evidence, but a lot of less direct evidence to build these types of cases. So I think it's absolutely possible.
Alex, I might be asking you to kind of go out on a limb here, but that's a very good point. And you touched on that a little bit in that, you know, these conditions were all present before the conflict. So how are we making that causal relationship? Any thoughts on what you've seen before and after the conflict started?
Well, I think there are a couple of points to make. One is that for a starvation crime to have been committed, it's not necessary for people to have died. It is only necessary for them to have been intentionally deprived of what is necessary for them to remain alive. And given that starvation, which includes not just hunger, lack of food, but also lack of water, exposure to disease, and in the case of children, essential maternal care. Those elements unfold over a long time. So if I were advising a prosecutor, I wouldn't say it's necessary to show that certain people have died as a direct result. That could be brought in just to show the gravity of what has happened. But it would be important to say these were the foreseeable consequences of these actions in the normal course of events. And one of the strengths of a prosecutorial argument in the case of Yemen would be the length of time in which these policies and actions were sustained, during which time credible, legitimate authorities such as the United Nations said, if you do this, this is what is going to happen. And yet those responsible continued. I want to just put in one other point here, which hasn't been made, which is a footnote, and I'm not sure how relevant it is in the Yemen case. It's certainly relevant in other cases, for example, in Ethiopia today, which is sexual violence as a starvation crime. We know that rape is a crime. We know that widespread and systematic rape may be a crime against humanity. But women who are survivors of rape may not be able to care for their children. Both physically and because of social stigma and ostracization, etc. And women who are threatened with sexual violence, living in fear of rape, may not be able to go to the market, may not be able to go to the shops or even to the fields, and therefore may not be able to access objects indispensable for their survival. So sexual violence used in a widespread manner is not only a crime in itself, but also can be a starvation crime.
Thank you, thank you. Laura and Milena, we've been talking about, are we concerned about, when you look at the victims here, or let me ask it this way, is starvation a crime, either a war crime or a crime against humanity all the time? Can you ever use starvation as a legitimate means of warfare?
Well, there are legitimate uses of starvation in warfare when it results unintentionally from blockades. It's obviously not, you know, something that that people are happy about, but it's not outlawed either. And when it's used for sieges, but there are caveats there, right? Because during siege, it can't be to attack a civilian population. It's to attack the combatants. Civilians must either be allowed to get access to humanitarian aid, or they must be allowed to leave the besieged area. But of course, in reality, that's very problematic, right? Because in situations where cities are besieged, there are often you know, people who are in one form or another incapacitated. You have the very old, the very young, pregnant women, the infirm. And so trying to actually allow these individuals to leave a city under siege is very problematic. And one example of this is the siege of Leningrad, where over the course of 900 days, nearly the entire population of the city starved to death. And so, although there are allowances in international humanitarian law for the uses of these types of tactics, it doesn't, that's not what's happening in Yemen.
Okay. Milena, you look like you might want to add something. Please do.
Sure. Again, I agree with Laura. I would add, so the thing here is that a degree of starvation as a consequence of otherwise legitimate means and methods of warfare is allowed, right? But I would argue that with regard to Yemen, there's no possible way to justify years of starvation, right? So we're talking, as Laura said, there's a siege and people go hungry for a short period of time. And I'm certainly not, justifying this, right? But in terms of IHL, if that is a consequence of an otherwise legitimate method of warfare, you might say that is allowed, or that doesn't give rise to violations of IHL, doesn't give rise to war crimes or crimes against humanity. But Jim, going back to your prior point about these principles of IHL, remember that whatever method of warfare you're using, you have to respect principles of distinction, proportionality, precautions, humanity, right? And so again, with respect to Yemen, I don't think that there is a plausible argument to be made that the starvation of Yemen is somehow a consequence of otherwise lawful methods of warfare. And I would argue that starvation, when you look at, for example, the customary law, when you look at the Geneva Conventions and Additional Protocols 1 and 2, starvation is outlawed under both Additional Protocol 1, which applies to international armed conflict. It's also outlawed under Additional Protocol 1, which applies to non-international armed conflict. And some of our audience members might know that the Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court was recently amended to add the crime of starvation with respect to non-international armed conflict. The Rome Statute already had this crime with respect to international armed conflict, not with respect to non-international armed conflict. And so all of this to say that to me, a parallel, for example, could be made to the use of nuclear weapons. Is it ever allowed under international law to use nuclear weapons? Well, sort of maybe in a very isolated, situation where you're using a low-grade nuclear weapon in the middle of nowhere, respecting principles of IHL. And so I would argue that with respect to starvation, it's sort of similar, that if it's a short-term unintended consequence of a legitimate means of warfare, then yes. But I really, those situations are going to be very few. And in what we've seen in Yemen and unfortunately some other places, starvation was used in an unlawful, illegitimate way as a prohibited method of warfare and should give rise to accountability down the road.
Thank you. Thank you. That seems like a very, very good transition to talk a little bit about accountability. Milena, what are the possibilities of accountability coming out of this conflict?
I mean, unfortunately, I hate to be very pessimistic, and the work of the students, the Yemen Accountability Project is so important, and I really, really am hopeful that down the line, sort of not now, but down the road at some point in the future, it does assist in terms of creating accountability. And Dean Scharf has mentioned this several times, that international justice is patient and persistent. In Cambodia, for example, the Cambodia Tribunal wasn't created until more than 2 decades after the Khmer Rouge regime atrocities were committed. So with respect to Yemen, although I'm not hopeful that anything will happen now, I am hopeful that things will happen in the near future. So just very briefly, some of the main possibilities in terms of accountability are the International Criminal Court, some kind of a hybrid tribunal, or national level prosecutions. And the reasons that these are really not likely to happen now are as follows. The ICC has jurisdiction over alleged crimes that take place on the territory of a member state, or if they're committed by a national member state. In Yemen, Yemen is not a member state of the ICC, and most of the crimes seem to be committed by nationals of non-member ICC states. And so then the only way that a case could end up before the ICC is if it were referred by the UN Security Council. Because of political gridlock, it is unlikely that the Security Council will refer the case against Yemen or this situation in Yemen anytime soon. In order for a hybrid tribunal to be created, you either need, again, Security Council action, or you need some kind of an agreement between the UN and the host country. Here, because of the situation in Yemen, first of all, it's unlikely that the authorities in Yemen, will agree to anything. I think there are lots of questions to be asked as to who the legitimate government of Yemen actually is, right? So we don't really even know who that is. And again, there's a lot of political gridlock within the UN, so not likely that a hybrid tribunal will be created. And then if we're talking about national level prosecutions, you can either talk about national level prosecutions in the courts of Yemen itself, which is a possibility, again, not likely today because of the ongoing conflict, because of the lack of actual government there, but down the road, that's an option. Or you can talk about prosecutions in the courts of another country under the principles of universal jurisdiction. And with respect to Syria, for example, we are seeing right now prosecutions in the national courts of Germany and a few other places under universal jurisdiction. So you could think of another country that has universal jurisdiction as part of its criminal law, and that it is willing to use its courts to prosecute offenders from Yemen. So not likely in the very near future, but hopefully we're building the case here for accountability, right? That maybe 10 years, 15 years, 20 years from now, there actually will be accountability in one of these forums.
I think you've touched on my next thought. What can be, if we're looking at actual accountability in the form of some kind of judicial mechanism a ways down the road, what should be happening right now to lead to that accountability?
Well, what should, so basically the Yemen Accountability Project is doing precisely what should be happening, right? What should be happening now is documentation, collection of evidence, and then, processes to store that evidence in a way that then allows that evidence to be admissible in court, whether we're talking about a national level prosecution or a hybrid or an international court. So that's why the Yemen Accountability Project is so crucial, because it's that first step towards accountability. With respect to Syria, I mentioned Syria. With respect to Syria, we've seen that the international community has stepped up through the General Assembly, the UN General Assembly, and created the so-called IIIM, this investigative mechanism for Syria, whose purpose is to collect evidence. We don't have that for Yemen, but we can, for example, hope that as a second step, there will be some kind of an investigative mechanism for Yemen. And and there have been international, there has been international community involvement. So there is, for example, a UN envoy for Yemen, and there have been things happening in the international community. But I would advocate for the need to actually create some kind of a mechanism similar to what exists for Syria with respect to Yemen, and that the evidence collected by the students is actually then transferred to that mechanism, and then that evidence then leads towards prosecutions, again, not likely now, but in the future. And we've seen this in Cambodia. It can be done.
Well, and with that, maybe I just ought to add that the Yemen Accountability Project is part of a larger global accountability network with students at Syracuse who have been collecting evidence and passing it along to the IIIM, as you have mentioned. We also have students at University of Toronto collecting evidence, and Florida International University on crimes that are taking place in Venezuela and elsewhere. And so this is part of a larger student effort to, again, collect evidence to the extent that these students can in moving forward. And so that's great. Well, we're down to just a couple of minutes.
Jim,
and
yes, let me just add to something that Milena was saying a minute ago. Because it is so challenging for the collection of evidence, particularly when you can't get into the country to look at the evidence closely. It's very important to have actors on the ground locally. So civil society actors in many countries have done a phenomenal job of helping and assisting prosecutors and putting together evidence for later prosecutions, but also for transitional justice mechanisms. And I think that, you know, that is something that even if we cannot now send people to Yemen to help collect evidence, we can build those relationships with civil society actors in Yemen to assist that process.
And actually, Laura, following up on that point, here's where I think NGOs and the international community can play an important role, and that is in terms of training those civil society organizations to actually collect and store the evidence. Because many of the local CSOs, although their role is crucial in terms of collecting the evidence, they really don't know how to store it, what to do with it. And so I think there's a key role here to be played by the international community, by NGOs, in terms of providing that training so that that evidence is actually stored and is admissible someday in courts.
Well, and I know, Milena, that, and of course we are running out of time, but I know that you have been very much involved in civil societies and some of the work that civil societies are doing, not only in Yemen, but elsewhere. And you make a very good point about the role that they would have going forward in the collection or preservation of this evidence. I have two questions I have several questions, but two are related. And so we can take about a half a minute and I'll ask those really to Laura and to anybody. But I have two questions asking about other involvement, Western states or other states' involvement in the conflict in Yemen in providing arms and other kinds of assistance. And is there an avenue for prosecution there? And so, Laura, since this was, of course, the topic of our first white paper by the Yemen Accountability Project, please take a few seconds and address that.
Briefly. Yes, so we do consider the United States and some of our Western allies to also be parties to the conflict that are potentially culpable for aiding and abetting war crimes and crimes against humanity through arms sales and other agreements with the Saudi-led coalition. So I would direct you to our aiding and abetting white paper, which is also available on the website for more information about that. And of course, feel free to reach out via email with any questions you have.
I do apologize. There are a couple other questions that we don't have time to get to. Some of them were answered during the panel, but we are running out of time, and I know how we do have to maintain a timetable, and so we do need to bring this to a close. But our panelists, I want to thank you very, very much, and I would like to ask Christine to say just a few words as we close. Of course, we have a big transition coming in the Yemen Accountability Project. Laura and many other of our officers who have been with the project from its start for 3 years are, of course, graduating. I hate to see that. I tried to stop it, but Dean Scharf said, no, we have to let them graduate. And so we have new leadership taking over. And so I'd like Christine to say just a couple words about where the project is going and what your priorities are in the next year.
Yeah, thank you, Professor Johnson. So again, my name is Christine Fabito, and I am so excited to be taking over this project and continuing this important work. Obviously, I have big shoes to fill, and I want to thank Laura, not only for her work on this paper, but also her amazing efforts in building YAP over the past 3 years as executive director. It's been amazing. I can't wait to carry the baton a little bit further here. But I also want to thank our panelists for being here today and contributing to such an interesting conversation and an important conversation. And, as we move forward as an organization, I'm excited to report that YAP's next big projects will be releasing our phase 2 materials and working on our 3rd publication, which will focus on the topic of destruction of cultural property in Yemen. So, we have so much work to be proud of and a lot to look forward to, and I hope you all stay tuned for future work. So thank you again to our panelists, and thank you all for tuning in. Eric will now provide some important CLE information for you all. So thanks.